We are now recording.
Okay. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Coyotenomics. This is an extra special episode where we have our guest, Kathy, and of course, your regular host, Tyson and Luke.
Hello.
Today we're going to be discussing open borders, and we're going to have quite a spirited debate.
So I guess I was thinking maybe we could clarify where we're coming from kind of first off, and I don't know, do you think we need any formal system, or can we just kind of free form? I think generally Tyson and I are more inclined to the open borders position, but I know there's probably certain ways in which we disagree.
You're the king, Luke. You decide.
I think
happy.
I think like maybe like putting a finger up or something if you're like waiting to talk would be good. But...
Cool, yeah, that's a good idea. So and I think just generally try to share the floor as much as possible. But I mean, also, the reason I wanted to do this video was I heard about this book by Brian Caplan called Open Borders. And it features the artist from Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal, Zach Weinersmith. I hope that's his real name. He does a lot of dick jokes, so it makes a lot of sense. And so we all have a copy of the book in case we need to reference a certain page, but it presents a lot of really compelling arguments, I think. And it breaks it down in terms of just the moral arguments in favor of open borders, and then it follows through on some pragmatic and economic arguments. Brian Caplan is an economist, and I think it's great. I'm a huge fan of this book. It's obviously something I believed beforehand, but it just made what I already believed all the more easy to justify. And I mean, I won't say too much about that. I technically, Kathy and Tyson haven't quite finished the book, so a lot of the discussion won't necessarily revolve around the book. It'll just be, our own thoughts. But this talk is inspired and sponsored by Open Borders.
Exactly.
I have a low tolerance for propaganda and indoctrination.
I just want to say that Luke was so excited about this book that he bought like 6 copies and has just been giving them out to people.
It's true. Yeah. It's true. That's not wrong. Yeah. So, and I don't even...
Kathy, would you like to go first, or would you like to have the last word? You're the guest. Do you want to introduce your position to start with?
Okay, well, I'm going to say some really controversial things, so buckle up.
Okay.
Or put your hands in the air. Whee!
No slurs.
That's a good starting point.
Put it in the context of the fact that I don't hate anyone at all. I don't feel that anyone is superior or inferior to anyone else based on their heritage. And I think that everyone is awesome because, I mean, really look at what all of our ancestors have been through for us to even exist here and now. It's incredible. It's amazing that we're even here. And I think we should all just be really grateful about that. And I think that it's okay to celebrate and conserve and breathe life into your traditions, history, and heritage, and worship your ancestors in a way. And I believe that Europeans should feel allowed to be, and that it's okay to maintain a majority, not only in Europe, but in historically conquered lands. And so that means all of the Commonwealth, the United States, and Europe. I think Europeans should be able to remain the majority, and we need closed borders more so to do that and encourage immigration, if we are going to, from cultures that we mix well with, our own cultures, European cultures. And that has nothing to do with skin color, because you can be adopted by Europeans, you can marry into a European family. All I care about is if you want to promote and conserve European history and culture, which is the Enlightenment values, freedom of speech, individuality, altruism, but we cannot be altruistic to the point that we destroy ourselves, which is what I feel open borders are. I think we need to see our countries as private property, and that no one is entitled to just enter our lands. I think that we need to be completely democratic and look at whether or not mass immigration is actually benefiting us. It's not about trying to make everybody else wealthy, but it's about being able to just say, we're allowed to care about ourselves the same way that I say, I need to care about my kids. It doesn't do any good for me to look after, let's say I was to try and sponsor a whole bunch of kids in the community who are not doing well, and then my kids end up not getting the same level of education. There's nothing wrong with having an inheritance. And I think that people like to hate people that have an inheritance, and we have inherited this land that our ancestors, being a settler was not easy, not at all. And as far as whether or not it's stolen, or conquered, and whether or not that was ethical or not, the thing is that we're already here. And so I don't think that we should, force on the Native people anything. I think that we need to work together and actually reconcile. And I think that's going to be a lot harder to do if we bring in a whole bunch of other cultures and their baggage as well. The book talks about basically that we come from countries with a golden egg. Well, that's because our ancestors worked their asses off and were really smart and made a very prosperous land with prosperous ideas. We don't necessarily have to feel obligated or guilty to ensure that everybody else gets that, because as Trump said, they come from shithole countries. I know that's really offensive to say shithole countries, but when you have people like, for example, in Nigeria, where they put tires around people's necks and light them on fire without the presumption of innocence like we have, or proper trials and that sort of thing, that's a shithole country where you can do those sorts of things. And these people are also very traumatized, and they have all sorts of things going on. And it's not my fault that they decide to have 15 kids and that they're overpopulating their countries, and that they're having wars and all those sorts of things. I would love to go over there and save every single one of those children if I could. I would love everyone to live in prosperity, but we have to look after ourselves. It's like being a lifeguard. I was a lifeguard for 8 years, and you're trained that when someone is drowning, that when you swim towards them, you go into reverse and ready, and you're ready, you kick a flutterboard towards them, and you help them rescue themselves. And you don't actually physically touch them until they're unconscious. And that analogy, I know an analogy is not an argument, is basically that there's only so much room in the lifeboat, and if we just bring everybody in, we're going to sink. And right now we're hurting, and we need to look after ourselves, and we need to make sure that there's no veterans that are homeless. We have to make sure that we don't have any homeless that are homeless. We have to make sure that everyone with addiction issues is getting the support they need. We have to make sure that our Native people have drinking water and proper housing, and that they feel as though they can get a proper education. We need to do all sorts of stuff. And for me, letting in a whole bunch of people from cultures that we have nothing to do with and that we've always been historically isolated from is not a good idea. And I know that this economist is arguing for it, but really, I think that there's so many, he seems to just pull numbers out of his ass. Like all of a sudden, someone who's poor is going to come over and be able to make $40,000 as a family a year. He doesn't explain where he gets that number from. Actually, sorry, it's 20,000. I just turned to the page. How does he even come to that number? He doesn't explain how he comes to that number. Why is it that someone with no skills from another country is going to be able to make money? And what we see is that they don't. They often stay on welfare, and there's often so many cultural issues as well, language barriers. You should have to speak English or French to be in our country, frankly, in my opinion, and speak it fluently and well. And we need to up the bar, and we need to, I think, promote traditional values. This comes from someone who was totally liberated and on the far left and like an extreme feminist who manized, if you will, full disclosure. And I think that we need to promote more traditional values and families and monogamy and, instead of promoting our people to have abortions, I think we should be, and by our people, I mean Canadians, old stock Canadians, I know someone who's a descendant of African slaves. Her descendants have been on this continent longer than I have. She's definitely an old stock Canadian. Protect old stock Canadians and do what's best for us as a people, which is just get rid of all of the this and that and whatever. We're Canadians, and that was what my settler ancestors believed. It's like you're not Russian and Ukrainian and German and all of these other things necessarily. Although I think that there is a revival and it's totally cool to celebrate those things and it's great. But we need to really see ourselves as Canadians and put ourselves first. What is best for us, not the rest of the world. We don't have to continually feel guilty and shitty all the time. Cool. I don't know. Yeah.
That's a good
Yeah. Good overview. Do you want to go next, Luke, or do you want me to go?
Doesn't matter. Do you have a preference, or I can certainly go?
I was just gonna say that I was glad she brought up the idea of cultural homogenization and how our culture has changed by bringing in immigrants, which is personally for me, I'm very pro open borders, but I do find the argument if you have no borders, you're gonna have no Irish culture, no Spanish culture, because eventually there'll just be enough mixing that everybody is the same. And I do think there is some value in saying we're going to put a fence around these people and let them be a specific culture. So I think that's a good point. I do think that the biggest thing that puts me in the pro open borders camp is that I think that same inherited cultural wealth that we all enjoy comes with an inherited responsibility as well. If we are going to say that we get to inherit the land that our ancestors conquered or settled or whatever, then I think we also inherit the crimes that our ancestors may have done. And certainly as descendants of British people, and I'm descendants of German people, we went all over the world and caused a lot of the damage that is leading to people immigrating to our countries. And I do think we need to bear that responsibility into the modern day. Specifically, I would talk about the Arab Spring, which I would say was largely supported, if not outright coordinated by the United States. And then it creates this huge wave of refugees. And I do think the United States bears responsibility to say, if we're going to support a coup in Libya, then we have to accept refugees of that coup that we orchestrated. And if we're going to invade Iraq, then we need to accept, or Syria, or name a place, basically. You have to be ready to bear those consequences and accept those people and help to fix the damage that has been done. And I don't think we get to, on the one hand, own, say, we'll take the land, but the damages were done a long time ago and we don't have anything to do with it anymore. So that's where I'm coming from. Luke.
Yeah, I think, obviously I agree with Tyson on lots of points. I don't necessarily like the idea of connecting yourself to a kind of cultural history so much, but generally speaking, I think I like the idea of open borders. For me, it's more based on Enlightenment values. And I really do agree with Kathy that there are certain aspects of how, where basically the history of the West. It's founded in a very strong tradition of human rights and these ideas that are very powerful and very important. They promoted all this peace that we enjoy today. They created all this wealth. They are in large part responsible for this incredible, unprecedented time in human history. And it's a huge shame that we don't seem to really respect or acknowledge that in our modern culture, and it does seem to be in the decline. So I do agree that it is very important to stick up for it and defend these concepts and these values, but I don't think that closed borders are a good expression of that, because I think one aspect of Enlightenment values or a system of consistent human rights is allowing people to migrate freely. So I like the idea of allowing people to have property and to defend that property. However, I don't think that it's a good analogy for our national, Canadians owning Canada collectively is very different from me owning my house. And if anything, I think closed borders violate property rights, because say somebody in Mexico, maybe I want to hire him to come over and illustrate some graphic novel with me or whatever. I can't freely bring him across the border to help me out because there's this closed border that prevents that. And I see that as just a violation of freedom of association, freedom of contract, and these basic Enlightenment values. So if anything, I can see how closed borders might be a pragmatic solution to a very difficult problem. Sorry, Tyson?
Oh, no, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Okay. Okay. If anything, I see it as a very possibly a complex, maybe pragmatic solution to an issue, but I see it as, generally speaking, these values are so important and they need to be stood up for kind of on principle. I do think that it's possible to defend concepts like just Western society. In my view, they should be defended in more of an emergent voluntary way, where maybe we have emergent city-states or emergent communities that are more oriented explicitly around these values. And they could have closed borders around them because it's all based on private property, like maybe like a closed gate community, essentially, that says, we all value these things explicitly, and if you don't value these things, you can't come. But the idea of collectively us Canadians claiming ownership over Canada, it seems very difficult to justify from a moral perspective. And so I have a great issue with it. And I do think with respect to the numbers in the book, he does reference other economists.
Wait, Luke, sorry, what is the moral issue?
The moral issue for me would be that to prevent people from doing business across borders is a violation of freedom of association, or just like, whatever reason. Like if people can just
hiring a local.
Yeah, you certainly have that option, but there are certain ways in which bringing things from a long way away is more efficient. Generally speaking, people do business locally, but the reason we sometimes bring a bunch of grain from a whole different country or like from far away is because it's, for whatever reason, at least at that point in the economy, in theory, it's more efficient, and that's reflected in lower price.
You can sponsor someone if you feel that they have better credentials. You can sponsor someone to come over. I believe, I'm not sure about Canada, but I know in the USA, you can sponsor someone to come into the USA. And so that's kind of like a citizen vetting, as opposed to just open borders and letting anyone who wants to come in, come in.
We have the foreign workers program here, which is very similar.
Yeah, but I still believe just in principle that if people want to freely and peacefully migrate to a new land, that should be okay. And I do think one of the reasons, I guess I'll save some of my points for later. I'll pass.
How do you know their intentions? How do you know that they're peaceful? You can't determine that. Like, I use the analogy of, if I see someone freezing on the street, a war-aged male, I can't just let him come and crash on my couch as much as I would want to and as much as it breaks my heart, because I don't know if he's the type of person that would either be fantastic and help me clean my house, or if he's going to rape my children while I'm sleeping. I don't know. Yeah. And so you can't just assume that people's intentions are positive when in their own countries they're killing each other.
I would just kind of fall back.
People are killing each other here in Canada too. Like, how do you know Canadians' intentions are pure? There's lots of horrible Canadians.
There are lots of horrible Canadians, and we have to deal with them, but we do have a higher level of social trust than a lot of places.
I would just fall back on kind of the Western Enlightenment value of innocent until proven guilty. And while obviously I would support your right to not let anyone into your house for any reason, I don't think that analogy applies as smoothly to a national stage as I think, because I just don't, I don't think that analogy works very well.
The term invader obsolete.
I
feel as though both of you guys don't have skin in the game, because I may be wrong, but I don't believe either of you have children. So it may not seem as important.
Well, the only reason I'd be having this conversation is because I really value the future of the world in which I live, and I want positive values to flourish. And so maybe not in the direct way that you do, but I certainly, I really want the best for things. But anyway, I know Tyson, I feel like I know Tyson had a thing.
Gonna ask, because in previous discussions we've discussed the idea of how we just think the concept of a nation state is perhaps a violation and not really a morally sound concept. And I was wondering if you see it as a distinct issue, or if your perspective on open borders just generally follows from the idea of we shouldn't really have giant national units dealing with each other.
I like the idea of nations, I like the fact that Japan is Japanese. I wish that Tibet was respected. I wish the Dalai Lama could return to Tibet and the Tibetan people could return to their land. If they would have had stronger borders and a stronger military, they could have protected themselves. And they ended up getting slaughtered by the Chinese, and they still not have been able to go back to Tibet. So I think that having like a land and your territory and having borders, I think that borders separate different ideas. And so, for example, our borders separate, freedom of speech from places where they believe that you should be murdered if you draw a picture of Muhammad, for example.
But doesn't that just create an atmosphere where might makes right? Like, we clearly didn't respect the borders of the Aboriginal peoples when we came here. We just moved in because we had a strong army, or they were naive, or whatever you want to call it. But we certainly didn't respect that when we established this nation. And similarly in China, like they're pushing into Tibet and not respecting it there. And without like, if you have closed borders are only as closed as your military can make them. So it just creates a tiered system where some countries get to restrict everything and some countries don't get to restrict anything.
Well, I think throughout history, people have continually conquered each other. Sure. And even before we came over to North America, the indigenous people certainly weren't a giant, unified, peaceful people. They were murdering each other and massacring each other and having plenty of wars. So I think we have to be here now and say, well, what are the borders? Let's respect these borders. If countries want to unify and create new borders, cool. But I think that we need to work on peace and mutual deterrence and respect the borders we have now. Maybe one day we'll be able to have a post-border society. Maybe if everybody adopts the Enlightenment principles. Islam thinks there'll be peace once everyone is Muslim. I don't think that we need to be tolerant and pathologically altruistic to the point that we tolerate intolerance and allow ourselves to be destroyed by cultures who don't necessarily have the same respect for other cultures as we do.
But aren't you ultimately making the exact same argument that they make? Like, you're saying everyone needs to assimilate to Western cultural ideas or else there cannot be global peace. And that's exactly what people in Iran say, except they're talking about their ideals that their society
Well,
builds.
It's like how science was perhaps invented by, different population groups, but science isn't specific to a specific population groups. The scientific method works regardless of where you're from or what you're doing, and so do the Enlightenment values. So if we have people that completely are diametrically opposed to freedom and we want to be free, then we can't let a large population of those people come in and potentially take away our freedom by force.
But they'll just say the same thing about Islam. They say, like, we can't let a large country of non-Islamic people come in here and change. Like, I think we need to have a mixing pot and let those ideas, like, let one idea naturally become more popular than the other rather than trying to control which one wins. I don't think you're ever going to get.
Well, it's not. I mean, let them stay in the Stone Age if they want to, but I don't think we need to let them into our world if they want to stay in the Stone Age. It's like just stay and make your own countries great. And if they aren't getting great, maybe there's something that they need to think about. Maybe they'll have their own enlightenment process. But I don't think it would be a good idea in World War II to immigrate a bunch of Germans either.
I'm going to just jump in here if I could.
Go ahead.
With respect to the borders being a good defense against invasion, I would agree with Tyson that I don't necessarily think that it's the border that is really the important thing. It's fundamentally the capacity to defend yourself with force. And I think, like, I agree that's an issue. And I think, like, fundamentally that's what it would be about. If a country is being, or a group is being invaded upon, they need to have the capacity to defend themselves. And borders wouldn't really matter, even if, like, you could have an open border, so to speak, and if an invading force like China attacks Tibet, like, what I'm saying is, if they had a strong military, they would have been successful. And the fact that they had presumably open borders has nothing really to do with the fact that they were conquered. I also think that you can have the people grouping together and celebrating mutual group identity and Enlightenment values without relying on a national border. Like, for instance, you could have like you could form a town like, Calgary that's very explicitly about these things, and where people tend to join that if they are excited about these values. And then maybe theoretically, maybe Montreal becomes culturally very different from these Enlightenment values. Maybe it becomes Islamic because there's a huge influx of immigrants moving in. And from my perspective, that's not really a hugely bad thing. At least it's no more bad than the population growing in a country far away. The idea that it's within Canada doesn't really strike me as meaningfully different than, And so I guess I'm wondering, why do you necessarily think that the emergence of a, let's say, Islamic Montreal would be a less preferable than a growing population within Syria or Saudi Arabia?
Because it's in my backyard. And my great grandfather, for example, he fought in World War I. He survived mustard gas, and he lived his life as an invalid with PTSD after World War I. He was part of that famous story where the Germans and the Allies actually exchanged, tobacco and partied together Christmas Eve and then shot each other the next day. I don't think that those people died and suffered to allow enemies of freedom into their countries. I think they would die in vain.
Are the people that were mustard gassing each other really the shining example of Enlightenment values? Like, I think that just shows that every culture is flawed.
Oh, for sure. But we are doing our best to improve upon that. And I don't think that it's utopian to think that we should have to turn into city-states. We already have a big, beautiful country. And we have wonderful borders being the Pacific and the Atlantic. And I just want Canada to stay Canada. And if we have people that want to support Canada and love Canada and make it a better place, and they can speak English or French, then, bring them on in. But we have to look at demographics and statistics. If you look at a map of, let's say, rape and murder of women, the majority of those rates that are the highest are in countries outside of the Commonwealth, outside of the United States, and outside of Europe. And so I don't think that we should just open our borders and let people who continually disrespect women and gays to just flood our nation. That's not going to, they have cases of rapes going up in Europe from the flood of immigrants. We had a case up in Red Deer just a little while ago of a man just coming in and hacking the shit out of a doctor, murdered him. We have, we're afraid to show exactly who's committing crimes demographically, but if you go to the Calgary Police Facebook page and you look up the names of the criminals, there seems to be a pattern. And there's cases where, for example, at a school in Calgary, a little girl either tried to commit suicide or had suicidal thoughts because she was Arab and she could speak Arabic, and she was being bullied in Arabic. And we're too politically correct to tell the kids that when you're in school, you have to speak English. And so she was being bullied in private. And so I think that there's, I don't think that creating ethnic enclaves within Canada is a good idea. I think it's better if we just remain Canadian to the best of our ability. And I understand that we want to be free and altruistic and caring and loving towards everyone, and we want to be sympathetic to historic wrongs and apologize and set up monuments of remembrance and, never forget history, make sure that we learn about all of those things, never repeat those horrors, and definitely apologize and reconcile. And I don't think we should become cold-hearted in that way, but at the same time, I think that we need to be able to feel entitled to protect and preserve this wonderful pillar of freedom, which is Western civilization.
May I ask you then, I think America, especially traditional America, is a great example of a very functional society that allowed open borders for a long time throughout its history. And I think one of the reasons it did work very well is because America very much stood for values of self-sufficiency and independence, and it was expected upon immigrants that if you come here, you're going to be expected to make your own way and create a life for yourself. You're not going to be given, a million handouts just because you're from another place or struggling. And I think that did encourage a certain type of person to come over. But despite that, I think America is someone who, despite certain issues, were a great shining beacon of these Enlightenment values. And I think it seems to be they're the perfect example of this type of society. And just the idea of standing up for freedom and these values while preventing migration seems to be a very clear double standard. And and obviously I think it's very dangerous to allow a lot of people from countries with lots of criminality into our own backyard. But yeah, I mean, back in the day with America, it was a cultural mixing pot in almost every way. You'd have huge influx of Irish people, and then they hated all the Irish, and huge influx of different groups, and the French and Germans, and some of them had
European.
But Irish people back in the day had incredibly high murder rates. Their rates were very very analogous to the current murder rates within the Black community right now in the States. But back in the day, it was all Irish people, all white Europeans, and that was a cultural mixing pot that ended up emerging into a relative to other societies, a very functional Enlightenment-based society. And that seems to be a kind of an example of what you are saying can't exist.
Well, as far as the Irish, murdering each other, that was the Protestants and the Catholics going after each other. And yes, there's been a lot of obviously fighting in Europe among each other. But they did, as far as their open borders were concerned, they really did just bring in a lot of European people, and they had to learn how to get along. Same with Slavic people. They considered Slavic people dirty and that sort of thing. And there was discrimination among each other. But at the same time, they tended to have Latin-based languages, and there were a lot of similarities that they could eventually melt into each other a lot easier than it is for other cultures to melt into each other. So it was open borders because they were trying to settle the land. Now we have infrastructure and we have welfare systems, and people are coming to take. We lose $40 billion. You want to talk about economics, if you go to Immigration Watch, I want to say, I'm probably getting that wrong right now. But we lose $40 billion a year spending money on services for immigrants who don't give the same back in taxes. So the net loss is $40 billion, not the gross, net loss. And then we also lose another $40 billion in immigrants sending money back to their home countries. And so we're not bringing in people into our country who are there because they're like, oh, I love Canada and I want to contribute. I'm not saying everyone. I'm just giving an example that because we're losing that big chunks of money, there's a lot of people where their loyalties are in other countries and they're coming over here so that they can send that wealth back. And when we're suffering from 20% unemployment for males in Alberta, when males are having the highest suicide rates in Alberta history, and then we're trying to bring in a bunch of people who are able to live in houses with, large numbers of people and can afford to be paid the minimum. It doesn't do any good for Canadians who are here already. And we have a lot of, our cities are crowded. We have a lot of infrastructure. We say we have all of this space, but that's not true because we have established cities. And then all of the space is beautiful natural land that we want to preserve and keep natural. And it's not like we're just going to sprawl into all of it and create cities. Cities don't just pop up artificially where you want them to pop up. They tend to pop up because there's an economic reason for that city to pop up in that area, as well as a good water source like a lake or a river.
Okay.
Tyson, you want to?
I was going to make 2 points. The first one that I wanted to make is like a purely theoretical point, which is that talking about like which countries we accept immigrants from and which ones we don't. I think that every individual has a right to be treated as an individual. And I would never like the idea that I would be judged by the actions of the average Canadian when I was trying to move somewhere. I absolutely can support the idea that if someone has a criminal record or they're on the sex offender registry or something like that, that's a means to block them from moving to our country. But I do not think it's fair to say India has a slightly higher level of rape, and so everyone from India is a rapist, and we don't want them to move here. Like, I do think everyone has the right to be treated as an individual. And the other point I wanted to make is that, in my opinion, like we talk about how much money we're losing to immigrants, but we're losing a vastly larger sum of money to homegrown Canadians. And for me personally, as somebody who kind of like bootstrapped themselves into a career and everything, I would much rather invest my tax dollars in an immigrant who worked hard to get here and is trying to make a better life for his family than someone who grew up here with all of the benefits and possibilities that every Canadian is born with and squandered it into a life of welfare. Like, I don't want to see my taxes go to a 30-year-old Canadian that hasn't been able to get their shit together because they've had every opportunity to do it. I'd much rather give it to somebody new who came here and is obviously motivated, determined, like aspirational, and likely to build more with it than I think, say, like the stereotype of a welfare mom with 5 kids cashing a bunch of checks from the government. Like, so what are your thoughts on that? Or either one of
Well, first of all, I want to say that I don't think that everyone is a rapist just because
no, I'm not trying to put those words in your mouth, but you are saying we should treat them differently because people in their country are more criminal.
True.
Well, if they have a higher rate of rape, for example, in Pakistan, there's actually a documentary done by Vice where they're showing how prevalent it is for young boys to be sex slaves. And like, sure, it's just common for someone to just like have their boy with them who's their sex slave. And it's very culturally, everyone just turns a blind eye and turns cheek to it. And it's considered normal. And that's what they're steeped in. So if they turn a blind eye to child sex abuse on a massive scale, then they're more likely. I'm not saying that the top doctor from Pakistan, who obviously isn't a pedophile and doesn't have any criminal record, shouldn't be able to come to Canada if his credentials meet what we require and he can speak great English. I'm not saying that you completely blacklist a bunch of countries. I'm just saying that you would be more stringent. And then as far as you saying that you'd rather support someone fresh off the boat as opposed to a Canadian who squandered everything and you don't know what that guy's been through. You don't know if his mom died and his wife died and his kids died in a fucking car crash. And you don't know how many taxes he's actually already contributed because it's social insurance. We all contribute those taxes so that if we get in I'm not a socialist, but I'm going to argue the socialist argument, is that they contributed or their parents contributed to this safety net so that if they get into a serious situation that they can have help. And I think that our welfare system is made to keep people on it. I don't think it's very good at all. If you make over a certain amount, all of a sudden your income gets cut right. All of a sudden you lose your welfare. So if let's say you get $1,600 a month and then you make $1,800, all of a sudden you only have $200 that month and you're homeless. So you're basically stuck on welfare. So I don't think it's a great system at all. And I prefer volunteerism. But since we do have a welfare system, I think it's better that we use it for Canadians because Canadians paid into it. And I don't think we should bring people over who are automatic welfare recipients. If we do have immigrants, I think they should be able to self-sustain themselves for at least 5 to 10 years before they have access to welfare if they need it.
I think that just comes down to seeing welfare differently. Like as you say, like you look at it as an insurance system, and that makes a lot more sense. I look at it as an investment system. Like I'm giving people money with the idea that you're planting a seed and they're going to grow into a tree.
I don't want to give other people money. I want to give money to my kids.
I agree. I don't want to give money to anybody, but some like lifelong welfare recipient in Newfoundland is the last guy that I want to be investing my money in, because after 20 years of welfare, they've proven that they're not going to do anything with it. I'd rather like bet on the new guy, like get the mystery bag and see what's inside.
I don't want to bet on the new guy or the old guy. I don't want people coming over here incentivized to come over here because we're going to give them free shit. I think that's a terrible immigration plan.
Why not? That sounds like a great immigration policy. Some guy's going to say, you know, if I got a $1,200 check from the Canadian government, I could build an amazing business with it. I'm going to come over here and get into that. Like that, those are the people that I want to give my money to. I don't think you have like homeless people from India immigrating to Canada. Like that's not what's happening. Some countries deal with that because they have like close proximity and people just walk across. But people coming to Canada are getting here on an expensive plane and going through a years-long process. Like they're motivated. At the very least, you can say they worked hard to get here.
They're motivated to get a free check. Not all of them, but a lot of them are motivated by the incentives themselves. And that's why I think we should remove the incentive, because we should really just have people coming over here who want to contribute to our society, not people who are going to be net negative.
Well, it's a tough sell to say we want people to move here so they can work harder and get less. Like you have to give people an incentive to come or they'll never come. Like
I think we should incentivize Canadians to have bigger families.
Wow, I don't. I think the child tax credit is one of the worst tax policies.
I think you should have kids, and I think your brain would rewire itself. In fact, there's a native tradition, and the natives used to actually, I can't remember which tribe it was, or if it was, exactly where this reference is from. You can fact check me on this, but they used to have it so that the men would smell the babies and spend a lot of time with them, because the pheromones would actually rewire their brain, the way that your brain gets rewired as a woman from being pregnant and all the hormones and the giving birth process and nursing. And so in order for the men to have a good bond with their children, something that I think that is missing in our society is good male bonds with their children, is that they would have the men just hold the children close and breathe in their cuteness. And so I think that you should have a whole bunch of babies, and I think you should spend your money on your babies. And if you do donate, I don't think it should be through taxes. I'd love to get rid of as much taxes as possible,
sure.
But and then give it voluntarily. And if you want to voluntarily support a refugee family and you have the means to do so, I wouldn't want to make laws to get in your way to do that. If you want to bring a family over from any country, that's awesome. I just don't think that it should be a top-down thing where a government just says we're bringing in, 400,000 people in immigration, then we're going to bring in another 250,000 people in 10-year easily renewable cheap visas, and then we're going to bring in another 250 in foreign students, and then we're going to bring in another 200 to 400,000 in permanent residents, and all of a sudden you just have like 1 million people or more over a year, every year. And it's just like, we only have 38 million people. We're just going to have, and they're all coming from non-European countries, because in 1995, they created an intersectionalist sort of criteria to bring people over, where they kind of discouraged European or any sort of culture that we have any sort of similarity to from coming over. Now, I like the fact that Japan is Japanese. If all of a sudden they opened up their borders to, let's say there's a huge wave of Mexicans that want to go to Japan, and they go over to Japan, and all of a sudden there's taco houses everywhere, and there's maracha music, and there's sombreros or whatever. Their culture is fucking awesome. I love Mexican culture. I think it's beautiful. But as a Japanese person, you would no longer feel like you're in your own home. You'd no longer feel like you're in your own country, and you have that feeling, and that's what it feels like when you're in Canada and all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of people walking around that look like patio umbrellas and letterboxes.
May I, sorry,
Go ahead.
Cool. First of all, I do think it's an interesting conflict that's happening, because I think you both would obviously agree, and I mean, I could maybe be convinced to agree this as well, more of a pragmatic way, but you obviously both agree that if someone had a criminal record or some sort of history or definable criminal issue, then they could be barred from entering. But I do think it's, maybe I'm just belaboring a point, but I do think there's an aspect of when you judge a country by its general trend, like I think you mentioned Pakistan, and there are certain regressive cultural aspects, you're inherently just judging them as a group, and that just seems very counter to the presumption of innocence and all these enlightenment, just the foundation of our justice system, and it seems very difficult to.
Just to interject, Luke, that's why I like your idea of citizen vetting. Because, for example, I'm not saying make an overall Muslim ban so that you can't bring in anyone who's Muslim. I know a wonderful woman who's from Palestine. She's pro-Israel, which is interesting because I can see both sides of the argument on that. I'm not going to claim either way on that. But she escaped Palestine because she was going to be forced to marry her cousin. Now, this got me searching and doing some research because we had some fantastic conversations. She believes in freedom of speech. She loves Canada. Her kids are awesome. Her husband's a hardworking, good-looking guy who's also Muslim. And just fantastic people. I'm very glad they're over here. And so I'd want the opportunity for those type of people to be able to come over here, even from those countries, but to have citizen vetting, where it's like, okay, I'm going to sponsor you. And instead of having welfare, it's like, okay, if you don't do well, I'm responsible for you because I'm sponsoring you to come over here. And so having citizen vetting, I think, is also very democratic, as opposed to just having completely open borders where anyone can come over. The fact that she was going to be forced to marry her cousin made me do some research, because in a lot of Muslim countries, the cousin marriage, either being born from cousins or marrying your cousin, is at about 70%. Now, if you marry your cousin and you have kids with your cousin, you have an over 70% chance that your child will have an IQ of 85 or less. And if you have an IQ that low, there's nothing you can be trained to do that isn't counterproductive, hence why the American military does not allow people into the military who have an IQ that low, because they can't be trained to do anything where they're not counterproductive. So you're going to have a whole bunch of people coming in on welfare. So if you have populations where there's that high of number of cousin marriages and potentially low IQs, then I don't think you should just let them come over en masse, where we have welfare states where they're going to end up being dependent on us, and they're going to end up draining us dry.
Yeah,
and they're going to cause extra stress and pressure to our social systems. Whereas someone like my friend that I have a good conversation with, and she's very intelligent, she learned English like that, she wants to assimilate. She told me straight up that people in the Muslim community don't want to assimilate, and that they don't want to learn how to speak English. As a broad stroke from her, she informed me of that, and that was really interesting. She opened my eyes to a lot of these things, because she says she doesn't want Canada to turn into the same place that she escaped from. You know? Yeah. And I told her that if they almost were going to send her home. Sorry, quick thing, they were almost going to send her home. And I offered to let her stay in my house illegally as an illegal immigrant, if that was to happen, because I love her to bits. And she totally believes in Western values.
Yeah. And yeah, that's awesome. I mean, and I also obviously agree with the point about welfare as someone who's not, I generally think that that's a moral hazard in general, even if immigration wasn't introduced into the mix. And so I'm easily convinced, that's no argument there. I think that, but to me, it seems like your main argument should be against a welfare system that tends to turn open immigration into more of a liability. And I think obviously the idea of intersectional immigration and basing who you bring in based on diversity rather than that's equal, extra insane. but I do think that, like, as long as you say, you think it's important for Western people to be breeding and reproduce and actually, creating more Western society, like, I agree. That's, going to be one of the ways in which we actually continue on Western values is by people who have Western values to have kids. But I think fundamentally,
adopt kids.
Yeah, sure.
It's okay. Absolutely. I mean, adopt kids from Haiti, adopt kids from wherever, and teach them in these values.
Adopt a child together, so.
There you go. But I think, fundamentally for me,
1 million subscriber episode.
You're going to introduce your new son. But I think fundamentally for me, it seems though, like Japan, for instance, Japan being a very culturally homogenous society that might want to protect itself, and they very explicitly do. Like, they don't allow Islam to be practiced in their society. They don't allow anything like that. I think if Western society was actually spreading and growing both ideologically and in terms of birth rate, I think neither is necessarily true right now. I think we have terrible PR for Enlightenment values, and we have a very low birth rate. And fundamentally, if those things were different, we would grow in whatever enclaves we developed or whatever societies we had. And even if we had immigrants from all over forming other enclaves, we would fundamentally be growing. And that, to me, that's the fundamental problem. And what I would say, I think you should argue against is these regressive strategies, these bad strategies that we're decreasing in population. And I think we need to address that fundamentally.
I would ask, if we have faith that Enlightenment values are like the best thing, then why do we need to stack the deck? Like, will not people over time naturally adopt Western values? And if they don't, if what really happens is that over time people abandon Western values and they die out, is that not an indictment of their value, that perhaps we didn't have it all figured out if billions of people from everywhere else in the world are coming over here and saying, this is horse shit, I want to stick with my old stuff? Like,
well, I'm not saying that
ideas should compete like naturally, and like the cream rises to the top. I have faith that rationalism wins out if you let it.
Well, for example, like, not an example, we're not going to have assimilation. First of all, we don't have magic soil. You don't automatically land in a place that believes in Enlightenment values and all of a sudden you have Enlightenment values.
No.
But you're not going to assimilate if you don't have to. If I was, for some reason, forced out of my country and I moved to another country and there was a whole bunch of English-speaking people there, I would probably stay and just speak English. I wouldn't want to assimilate either. I don't blame them. But if there's only a small trickle and I have no choice but to live in a community where I have to learn their language, I will assimilate a lot easier. So I think it's also the amount of people.
So let me ask you a probing question, if I may. Do you believe in Enlightenment values because you were indoctrinated in them in a society where they're ever present? Or do you believe in Enlightenment values because you see an inherent worth in them and think they have value? Like, do you think if you were born in Saudi Arabia, you would think Enlightenment values were horseshit? Or would you gravitate towards them for the same reasons you gravitate towards them here?
Well, I think that currently we're not really promoting Enlightenment values, and we haven't been for a while in our education system.
I agree with that 1,000%. But
so yeah, I don't think it's because I was indoctrinated into it. I think it's because I studied on my own interest Enlightenment values, and it really resonated with me. I think that if I did grow up in another culture, that I probably, I have a disposition to be more disagreeable than most women, but I would probably go along with the herd. I like being a heretic. I do have that disposition, but it is very hard to, also, if you're if you're in survival mode all the time, then you're going to be more likely to not be able to think higher thinking if all you're worried about is getting your next meal. So I understand that these countries are also kind of stuck. And I don't think the solution is bringing them all into our country, because if you've ever seen the gumball analogy, he shows how there's far more births than we could ever bring people into our own countries, and we'll end up swamping ourselves. So I think it's better if we made ourselves really, really strong, and we make sure that everybody here has clean drinking water and all that sort of good stuff. And then from there, then we go and we do our best to rescue other people and help them in a way that's democratic. We can't force ourselves, we can't be imperialist, but try and help people get out of, just start with war on poverty. Try and make sure that people are getting food and all those sorts of things, but we can't do a whole bunch of foreign aid and helping other people until we help ourselves. And right now, I think Western civilization is hurting. I think we might even be at the fall of Western civilization, hence the very terrible art, which is something that happened at the end of the fall of Rome as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if I may interject, I do think
50 seconds.
Oh no, timer starts now. Yeah, I obviously agree with a lot of what both of you are saying. I do tend to side with the idea that even though like I've been reading a lot of, not reading, I've been listening to a lot of podcasts by Douglas Murray, who wrote The Strange Death of Europe, and he talks a lot about how there's a huge influx of Islamic migration into Europe, and I think like the majority of Austrian youth right now are Islamic, and it's very likely to see that that's going to be turning into an Islamic state pretty soon. And I think largely that's probably due to that country in particular bringing a lot of refugees as a government program, much like Canada does. There's government programs where they bring people in, and I don't support that. And I think that's more complicated. But for me, it still comes back to like the underlying moral issue. And one analogy that I like quite a bit is that it might be pragmatically useful to reduce the birth rate within regressive communities, like say maybe the Appalachian Valley communities in the US, or like with very low IQ birth rates, or like certain communities that just predictably produce bad results. It might be preferable from a pragmatic viewpoint to legally prevent the birth of more people. But I see it as such an affront to the basic values that we're supposed to be standing for in this country that I would never promote such a thing. And I think that's very analogous to me to immigration. And I'm wondering if, Kathy, you can kind of talk about why, because I know I've asked you this, you obviously are not against controlled birth by government. And do you think that there's a meaningful moral difference between legally restricting birth in a country and the other? And I guess maybe Tyson wants to weigh in on this too. I don't know. I'll let you both.
I just wanted to piggyback off that before you respond. If the ultimate goal is that we don't want Canadians with low IQs, or we don't want Canadians who commit crimes or whatever, like there's never a discussion of you committed a rape, you as a homegrown Canadian committed a rape, so you're renouncing your citizenship and we're kicking you out. Like, why do we allow homegrown Canadians to continue to drag us down if we're going to take such a hardline stance against every other country in the world? Like, why not say if you have an IQ of less than 80, you can go somewhere else and we're kicking you out? I don't understand why people get grandfathered in.
Well, anyway. Because people care about their kids. So if you have a kid who has a low IQ, that doesn't mean
he's a bad immigrants. Like, I care about people halfway across the world just as much as you care about your kids.
And I consider that pathological altruism, because I feel that you're caring about people so much around the world when we need to help ourselves first, just the same way that you would need to put on your own oxygen mask when the airplane is depressurized before you put on your child's oxygen mask, because we can't help other people if we're weak. And so I want to be in a position where we can help other people. But as far as like, like I said, the map, if you have very, very high rape areas where it's almost, they actually do have a rape culture, as feminists like to use that term. Canadians, we put them in jail. We don't need to overfill our jail system as well, which costs tax dollars, with a whole bunch of foreign rapists as well.
Go back to the old system, put them on an ice floe and let them go somewhere else. Like, why are we so invested? Why do I have to be more invested in your kids than Ahmed's kids? Like, at the end of the day, like,
I'm more invested in my kids.
For sure you are. But you're telling me that I should be more invested, that I should be more invested in Newfoundlanders than I am in, like, Turkmenistan.
If you want to, I'm just saying it shouldn't be a top-down government thing where they're more invested in other nationalities and other countries than they are in Canadians, because their job is to look after us. If you personally have the financial means to sponsor a family from any country in the world and you want to bring them over and be responsible for them, you're welcome to do so.
I know, but all my money's already tied up because the government's spending it on somebody else's kids. Like, I would love to have all that.
The government isn't spending any money on my kids.
Deserve it, but the government is deciding that kids in Prince Edward Island deserve my tax dollars more than kids in Istanbul. And I honestly cannot say that I'm any more invested in a Canadian halfway across. There are people in the United States who live much closer to me and have much more in common than me than a person in Nunavut or even Vancouver, to be frank. Like, why at all is the government invested in these people?
Well, because that's the role of the government, is to look after the people. And so if the government wasn't going to look after the people in Nunavut, they should break off and they should create their own independent country that looks after them and looks after their interests. And I think that the people in Nunavut are very vulnerable. There's many things that they need to deal with. And I think that we should be supporting them to the best of our ability and to allow them to be self-reliant. There are going to always be people in your society. I don't think that we should completely abolish welfare. There are always going to be people in your society who do need help, and we can't swamp and flood that system.
But why am I supposed to be more invested in one random stranger than the other because they have a different stamp on their passport? Like, why can't I make the decision that children in Sri Lanka that are working in shoe factories and starving to death are more important than the youth in Eastern Canada that I also have nothing to do with and can't relate to? Like, why is it decided that I'm more invested in one of those groups than the other?
You could become a conscientious objector to the tax that goes towards welfare. And then from there, if you wanted to, you could go and you could create an organization that collects, various donations, and you could go over to Sri Lanka and you can volunteer and you can help those kids. And in fact, it tends to be European people and European cultures that go over to other countries and actually help other people. I try and name a single other nationality where en masse they have Doctors Without Borders and all of these other things to go and help other people in other nations. It doesn't really happen.
I mean, in the Middle East, that's a huge thing because like there's a much higher cultural expectation of charity. So they do have a lot of...
Why don't they let in all the refugees into those countries where they can culturally assimilate a lot easier?
I don't think Iran accepted far more refugees than any other country on the planet.
Not Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia
shit because they're a U.S. puppet. But that's our culture. That's not their culture.
Oh yeah, I never answered your question about where you discussed how it's kind of our fault that all of these people, and I don't know if it necessarily is our fault or if there's a series of dominoes and we're only focusing on when the USA got involved and Canada and the other, nations, coalitions there. Is it our fault, or was there a Taliban and various Islamic groups?
Built the Taliban. They propped them up during the 80s to fight the Russians. Like, the U.S. built Saddam Hussein. They propped him up to fight against Iran. Like, they created these problems. They created these refugee crises. And for people to turn around and say, oh, it's not our fucking problem, like, they should go somewhere else, is just patently ridiculous. People today are actively reaping the benefits of those wars.
But okay, so if you look at just because they propped him up, did they prop him up knowing that he would become rogue?
Yes, absolutely. They propped him up knowing he was an Islamic extremist because he opposed communism. They knew about all of it. They knew that women were getting hung in the streets. They knew that there was no religious freedom. They knew that it wasn't a democracy. And they said, we don't give a fuck. We want the TAPs to stay on, and we don't want the Russians to get a foothold. And that was the end of it.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. So when they propped him up in the 80s, as you say, it was to stop the communists. And so did they feel as though there would be less human suffering by doing so?
I don't think they really cared. I think they felt that they would create an allied state for a time in the Middle East where that was important. And that was the end of the thought process. I don't think they thought about a refugee crisis 30 years down the road, but I don't think that means that they get to be absolved of those consequences either.
What if they totally knew that it would create a refugee crisis? What if there are globalist elites who are trying to create this entire mess?
Then you own those consequences. The same way that you own the same way that you get to enjoy the land that a colonial power conquered, you have to pay the consequences of a government that did that. You can't have one and not the other. Either you say, we have no right to be here because we had nothing to do with that government, and also we don't owe any penalties because of this other government, or you say, we're part of this country, we're invested in this project, and the government doesn't always do what I want, but I get the benefits and the consequences.
So you feel the consequence of the First and Second Gulf War is that we should allow as many people to come over as possible because you believe it's our fault, even though I'm not actually connected to anyone directly who had any involvement in that whatsoever, nor was I a part of the decision process.
You're connected to hundreds of people that voted on that issue. The same way, like, you're not connected directly to somebody who decided to establish the British North America Company or to conquer Alberta or incorporate as a province, but you still, I assume, feel some right to live here because as a Canadian, you were a part of that project. And as a Canadian, you were part of the NATO project of the Gulf War, and you were a part of all these other things that our government did. Or you're a separate entity and you don't get any of that. Like, those are your options, in my opinion. I don't think you get to take the good stuff and reject the bad stuff.
Why can't you reject the bad stuff and say that those are elitists and we need to fight against the global elitists and we should
because
be able to
elitists conquered this country. It's the exact same fucking elitists that came over here and said, we want beaver pelt hats, so we're going to conquer this country. That was not working class people that came over here. Like, it was rich people who could spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a boat to go across the sea and bring back pelts. Like, it's all elitists making all the decisions.
May I pop in here? Cool. It might seem like I'm responding to something a little bit back here, but I
just want to unpack this open borders thing.
I do think it should be separated, the concept of helping people and the idea of allowing them to freely move around and allowing them their own rights. Like, I do agree that I don't believe in positive obligations as a general concept. I don't think anyone has a positive obligation. I think you have negative obligations to do no harm, but I don't think you need to help anyone who comes over here or is here or anything like that. So I think there's a happy middle ground, at least in my mind, as someone who doesn't believe in these programs of welfare, that there's a happy middle ground between not promoting helping them and enabling certain antisocial tendencies, and also not restricting the rights and the free travel of individuals. And also, I do think, I didn't quite get a response from you, Kathy, about my question about the idea of restricting childbirth from regressive communities. I think that's very analogous to restricting immigration from possible regressive communities, and I'm wondering what you see as the moral difference between the two.
Well, restricting births is a form of genocide. So there's a big difference between telling people that they should stay, that, you know, I need to have my country and our culture, and we can feel comfortable here the way that it is, but I don't think that anyone should be restricting people's birth. But you should, if we could give them the option, but that's not necessarily our responsibility either. Just let them handle themselves. And I don't agree, like when China had a one-child policy, now they only have a two-child policy. I don't like people being restricted on reproduction. They can make their own decisions and they can suffer their own consequences. Although if children are dying and starving because people are continually making bad decisions, at what point in time, just like a social service worker needs to step into an abusive household, if kids are being severely abused and neglected, at what point in time should we step in and say, you know what, there's a whole bunch of kids that are starving because people are having 16 kids each, and say, you know what, we're going to offer free vasectomies. We're going to put in a few $1 billion into offering people vasectomies voluntarily, no forced birth control. There is the example of the human rights violation where Israel brought a whole bunch of Ethiopian Jews to Israel, and they gave them vaccines, and it turned out that there was birth control in the vaccines, and they lowered the Ethiopian Jewish population's birth rate by 20%. And that was, I can't stand the Young Turks, but they did cover that, and I appreciated them covering that. And so that's my reference there for that, if you want to look up the genocide of Ethiopian Jews, because restricting birth is genocide. There's a terrible history among indigenous people and people in Africa where there was forced hysterectomies as well. And I just think it's a terrible, dark, horrible thing to tell people that they can't have kids.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, obviously, first of all. And I do think it's an interesting moral dilemma that there is a point at which intervening on a family's autonomy to protect the children, there is a point at which that makes sense, but it's a very difficult question. But obviously that's maybe a different whole talk. But I do think maybe someone could say, no, you have the right to have kids, just not within our borders. Like, you can just leave. You can just leave and have kids over there. Like, that's not necessarily genocide, because you're giving them full right to have kids, but just not within Canadian borders. You're not forcing hysterectomies. You're not forcing birth control. You're just saying, we don't want any new Muslims in Alberta or Canada. And I think that's fundamentally very similar to a restriction on immigration.
Yeah, you can't do that either, because how can you just tell someone that they can't have a kid in Canada when they're over here? If you allow them over here in the first place, they should be allowed to have as many kids as they want.
But why is that? Why is that morally different? Like, what's the difference between saying, because you're over here, you can bring more Muslims over here, or, you know, just to allow just new Muslims to come over? Like, we don't know that kid. That kid could be the worst person in the world. We have no vetting process. Well,
the vetting process would be citizen sponsorship. If let's say I'm searching whatever, even just the kindness of my heart, I want to bring over someone who's suffering in those lands, and somehow I meet Manal, well, I'm not going to use her name, sorry, my Muslim friend, and I, found her online, and she says, I'm going to be forced to marry my cousin. I'm in love with this man from Argentina who's also a Muslim, and I need help. Then, if I have the financial means, I might be like, okay. And, we gain a rapport, and I'm like, wow, she's for Western values, and I vet her and I bring them over. It's not saying no Muslims. It's saying vet for it. And, she wants to take off the hijab, but she feels scared because there's such a large community where she feels as though she might suffer harsh consequences and potentially be ostracized or worse, because she wants to start rejecting Muslim practices more so and more so. She's just a cultural Muslim, the way that you would have a cultural Catholic, for example, who maybe has never even read a Bible but was just born into it, and has a lot of criticism of Catholicism, but then also appreciates some of the symbolism and some of the good aspects of it. Mind you, anything good in Islam is plagiarized Judaism and Christianity, because Muhammad used that to make it more palatable to convert people in those religions.
Cool. Okay. Well, and obviously I think we would all find the idea of sponsorship as being a nice middle ground solution that we could all promote. I would just probably go more in the direction of even less restrictions. But yeah, and I think ultimately I'd like the idea of trying to describe the different moral things going on here. I don't have any desire to win at this debate, but I like that I think we're doing a good job of describing the different kind of pitfalls and issues at play here.
I think it's a wonderful exercise in critical thinking. It's like none of us are trying to win. We're not trying to come up with a consensus solution as, okay, this is what we're going to believe now based on all the information. It's like, okay, leave it open and everybody gets to think for themselves. And I think that that's something that we really need to promote more of in our society, is thinking for yourself.
Yeah, and hopefully we all learned something and changed a little bit in the process. I
haven't changed one bit. I ain't no dirty pinko.
I mean, I honestly don't know if I changed that much, but I certainly learned new things. And, you always hone your perspective in subtle ways by new interactions, and it's a pleasure.
I'm just joking.
I have maybe, it sounds like we're moving towards a conclusion. I had one final question for Kathy that I wanted to ask. If like you took the welfare state out of it, like let's say nobody's paying any taxes, the government's not providing any services, like it's just about like who's here and who's not. Do you have any problem with somebody from anywhere who can pay their own way, pay their rent, and like afford to move here? Like if we move out, if we remove the incentives and the services and things like that, under a system like that, could you be supportive of open borders, or would you still want to have some sort of restriction on who's coming?
Well, first of all, Tyson, I love the way you think, and I love your questions, and I find it really stimulating getting to interact with you. So I really I appreciate this, and I'm honored to be here. And yay! And so yeah, I would still be for the cultural argument. I would still be for more closed borders, just because and also within the context of intersectionalism. I'll touch upon that in just a moment, but if I don't want people to come in here and take away my freedom of speech, if you have people that are protesting freedom of speech outside of the French consulate instead of, condemning terrorist attacks, I think that's a very big issue. And they have people that are trying to bring in Motion 103 and potentially bring into law that you can't draw a picture of Mohammed because people are going to be offended. We have the right to offend in our society. So if people are going to come in and try and change our country the way that they want it to be, that's an issue. But so yeah, I would still want closed borders or more so closed borders for that reason, for the cultural reason, besides just the welfare. And I wouldn't also want to pay zero taxes, because I feel like we need a strong military, we need a police force. Those are common goods, including water treatment and infrastructure and garbage.
It's more of a thought experiment. Like if you take the dollars out of it, is it still an issue? But yeah, I think that's a very fair point.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'm at the point where I feel like I at the end of every episode, Kathy, we always have a portion where we have our like final thoughts. We just kind of go around. I'm at that point where I feel comfortable, where I would just be at that point. Anyone else have any other issues they want to talk about or touch on, or queries for other parties, or what's happening?
I'm pretty good. I think we touched on all the big ones.
Cool.
We should give Kathy the last word because she's the guest.
No, you guys go first. Whatever. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, it's always who gets to have like the final word, where no one's allowed to like question you after. We're gonna give that to you.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thanks, Tyson.
I'll make Luke go first because he's been quiet.
Okay, cool. Well, yeah, my final thoughts on the issue would be that obviously I'm a fan of many of these Enlightenment values that celebrate human rights, and I think those are very worth defending. And I do think that these things can be defended in the context of these voluntary societies that can integrate welfare societies. You can have emergent voluntary welfare societies that help your own. And I think you can more consistently promote these Enlightenment values when you don't have to include these, the pragmatic realities of politics. And I just want to do one more shout out to this book. There are, like, we talked a lot about moral arguments today, but there are just a plethora of nuanced just variations between there's open borders, there's closed borders, and there's a million little positions in between. And there's even a chapter on these like keyhole solutions, which address very pragmatic, specific arguments. And it's not necessarily an argument for open borders. It's an argument, it generally argues for open borders, but also provides a lot of nuanced middle ground roads that might serve as incremental stepping stones on the journey towards a more free and egalitarian society. But yeah, so I'll just say I think that it's a political possibility, and I think that I think it's definitely worth checking out. It's very cheap right now as well to buy. It's only like $20.
Yeah.
Tyson?
I guess my final thought that I wanted to highlight is that I think like the darkest trap of nationalism is that it somehow convinces us to be more invested in certain strangers than others. And I think if you really think about it, like other than like your tribe, I'll use that term broadly, like the people that you're around that you really care about and are really invested in, I think all strangers are equally unimportant to most people. And I would push people to question how much the stamp on someone's passport really affects how invested you are in their life.
Cool. Well put.
Kathy, final words.
Final words.
Bring us home.
Well, I'm just really happy to be here, and I really enjoyed that conversation. And I don't really have any zingers to complete with. Yeah, you guys are great. Thank you for debating me and engaging and talking about such a taboo subject that people are afraid to talk about, and not trying to like demonize me as some sort of like, you know, evil person or something for believing these things, because my point of view is very counter, I think, to the mainstream of what we're supposed to believe in. And I believe there's a lot of propaganda out there. And I think that the fact that there is propaganda means that there's still hope.
Okay. Absolutely. I think it's important for ideas to like live or die in the furnace of spirited debate. So
rigorous inquiry.
Yes.
Yeah, no, that was great. And obviously, while I disagree with both of you, I mean, on things, I know you're both very sincere and well-meaning people. And for that reason, it's always a pleasure to have these types of conversations. So yeah, that was great.
We'll catch you coyotes next time.